This short film makes the case for evidence-based teaching. What is it and why should we use it? If you're watching this, it's probably because you want to improve someone's learning, and we think that an evidence-based approach will work best. We think this is an important message. If you agree, we would like you to send the link to this clip to as many people as possible. But what does evidence-based teaching not mean? Well, firstly, it doesn't mean that you have to carry out the experiments in your classroom. And it doesn't mean simply that you collect data about your students and use it in your teaching. Of course, both these things are valuable, but it's not what we mean when we talk about evidence-based teaching. In this film, we'll ask, is current education evidence-based? And then we're going to introduce some neuromyths, or some ideas about the brain which turn out to be not supported by the evidence. We're going to look at the case for a national centre for evidence in education. Then we're going to look at what the evidence from classroom experiments shows us, what useful lessons we have learnt from that, what useful lessons have been learnt from neuroscience which can be applied in the classroom, and then look at the way ahead, how we can use this evidence in our practice. We're probably more familiar with the idea of using evidence to solve crimes. If the police didn't use the evidence in court and we were convicted, we would consider that to be a breach of our human rights. We're also familiar with evidence-based medicine because we've been benefiting from that for at least 100 years. If doctors prescribed medicines for us which hadn't been tested, we'd be quite upset. Similarly, engineering is evidence-based. Engineers can build wonderful structures like this because they have used the evidence about the strength of the material in their design. If they didn't use the evidence and the building fell down, we would be angry. So the question is current teaching practice evidence-based? Well, it depends. If you look in the classroom, particularly in the classrooms of highly effective teachers, we see lots of things which are supported by evidence. That is, even though the teacher may not know about the evidence, highly successful teachers are using evidence-based methods. The problems come usually when we are asked to do something by somebody else. This is Dylan William, former Deputy Director of the Institute of Education. Now, he did a lot of the early work with Paul Black on assessment for learning, which is based on the evidence from formative assessment research. And what he says is that there is a whole lot of policy which has been implemented over the years which has little or no evidence. There have been debates about whether we should have bigger or smaller schools, whether to reduce class sizes, whether to abolish the middle schools where there are those, whether parents should be given more choice, perhaps we should give them vouchers, whether we should build academies or new buildings, or schools for the future, or free schools, whether we should install more computers in schools, and whether all teachers should be given an interactive whiteboard. The problem is, all these things are lovely, but there is very little evidence, and what Dylan Williams says is it would be much more cost effective to train teachers in effective methods such as formative assessment. Some more concerns come from this OECD study, Understanding the Brain, the Birth of a Learning Science. They've identified what they call neuromyths, that is, a whole lot of ideas which many of us have about the brain which turn out to be wrong, to be not supported by the evidence. The first one is left brain and right brain, the idea that some people are dominant on the left and some people are dominant on the right. Well, clearly the brain does have two halves, but it's connected together by hundreds of thousands of connections. And when we carry out any thinking task, even tapping our finger, never mind playing a musical instrument, we are in fact using different parts of the brain on both sides. Of more concern is the idea of VAK, or that our students are either visual or auditory or kinesthetic learners. Now clearly individuals can express a preference, but where the experiments have been done and the so-called visual learners are taught in a visual way, etc., etc., no benefit has been found to the learning. Another myth is that somehow or other we're only using 10% of our brain, that 90% of it is somehow idle, and that if we could find the magic formula which would get it to work, we would all be as clever as Einstein. Again, the neuroscientists say this is completely wrong. In fact, the evidence seems to be almost the opposite, that when people become skilled, they use less of their brain than when they are unskilled. Brain gym is something which has been practiced a lot in primary schools. The claim here is that certain exercises stimulate parts of the brain, in fact parts of the brain that other exercises cannot reach. It wasn't until 2009 in this article in the Daily Mail that Ed Balls, the then Minister of Education, had to admit that there wasn't any evidence to support it, that brain gym for pupils was in fact pointless. In this climate of lack of evidence, the University of York has established the Institute for Effective Education. And their vision for the future is that educators and policymakers will have easy access to research and confidence in its reliability and purpose. Using evidence will be as important in teaching as it is in medicine or in science. Now, one of the people behind this initiative is Estelle Morris, who you may remember as the only Minister of Education who had in fact herself been a teacher. And this is her vision. She chairs the strategy board which has set up the Institute for Effective Education. She hopes that we will transform the relationship between researchers, teachers and policymakers so that education is driven by evidence, not opinion and fads. NICE is the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence. NICE digests the evidence and makes it accessible to doctors. Of course, doctors don't have the time to trawl through every research paper published all the way around the world, so NICE does it for them. Well, a NICE for education would be good for us teachers, would it not? It'd be really great to have a publication where we could go and find out what the evidence is so that we could apply it directly in the classroom, because we don't have time to trawl through research papers ourselves. The Institute for Effective Education is exploring the idea of a national evidence centre, but today, in 2011, this is still what we might call a work in progress. So let's look at some important sources of evidence for education. Well, of course, as mentioned earlier, we can look at what excellent teachers do. Then we can look at classroom-based experiments, that is, where we've looked at the same thing tried out in an experimental basis with control groups. And finally, we can look at brain studies or the neuroscience. All of these can provide us with good sources of reliable evidence. But where is it? Where will we find it? Well, as mentioned before, thousands of experiments have been done worldwide, but it's mostly hidden in academic journals. One way to bring all that information together is to look at meta-studies. These combine the results of dozens of studies, which make it more accessible for us as a teacher. Let's say there are 4 studies about a particular classroom technique. Well, there may be 40 or 400. The meta-study team will first of all check out the research design. Was there a control group? Were there enough pupils? Was it over a long enough period of time? If the quality is not high enough, they'll be able to eliminate whichever studies are not good enough and then combine into the meta-study just those studies which are of good quality. This would mean that teachers have got much less to read and much more reliable evidence. So, just to give you an idea of how many people would be involved, if we look at the evidence about cooperative learning, that is, students working together in a group rather than on their own in many different ways, there are over 300 studies which have had 24,000 participants. With research like that, we can be really confident that the results are reliable. Where can we find this information? Well, we can find it, for instance, in this teacher-friendly book, Evidence-Based Teaching by Jeff Petty. And he has drawn on 2 major sources of information. One is this book, Visible Learning, by John Hattie. This is a synthesis of about 800 meta-studies, which has been done in New Zealand. Lots of information drawn together in one place for us. Similarly, this work by Robert Marzano's team, Classroom Instruction That Works, they've only looked at classroom-based activities, and they give us 10 reliable methods of using evidence in the classroom. And this is a list of 10 highly effective methods. We won't go through them in detail at this point. And the information is available to you on the website where you found this clip. Each of these methods will improve the results of your pupils by between 1 and 2 grades at GCSE or A level, so we can be sure that each of them is going to have a significant impact on results. So what does the evidence from the brain show us? Well, a great deal. One of the reasons we don't know about it as teachers is that a lot of it is new knowledge since 1990, or even new knowledge this century. That's because in the 1990s, new scanning devices were invented which create images like this, showing which part of the brain is active. Before 1990, this information was not available. A lot of this information is in academic neuroscience journals, but to make it more accessible to teachers, there are now a whole group of books which bring the evidence and make it more accessible to teachers, such as How the Brain Learns by David Sousa, The Learning Brain, Sarah Jane Blakemore and Uta Frith, Brain Matters, Patricia Wolfe, and The Brain at School by John Geek. I've mentioned just 4, there are dozens. What are the lessons from the neuroscience? Well, many, but 2 main ones. Firstly, that the brain has specialised areas. There's not one place where intelligence is found. Consequently, if we improve brain skills, we will also improve intelligence. Also, we now know that memories and learning is when brain cells link together. And so there's an important finding that we can't learn something which can't be linked to something which we already know. Well, we can learn the words of a song or something, our times table by rote, but if we want to understand something, it has to be linked through to our existing knowledge. But do these 2 sources agree? Does the neuroscience back up what we see from the classroom evidence? Well, let's just take a look at the top 10 methods. Pick number 5, graphical methods. Well, the classroom evidence shows this is highly effective. Using graphical methods could improve your pupils' results by more than 1 grade. But if we ask the neuroscientists whether there's a reason why this is the case, they'd say, well, it's fairly obvious. The brain has a large visual cortex, specialised for analysing visual images. If we use it, learning is likely to be improved. So we have 2 sources of evidence, both of which agree, and we can have a huge amount of confidence this is going to improve the learning of our students. The great thing about evidence is it puts you in control. It's access to evidence which empowers doctors. In fact, it's the basis of their professionalism. It's not a set of instructions. So what action could we take? Well, as teachers, there's no need to wait for somebody to give us permission. We can start to use these methods right away in our classroom. We could request training in our school or college, and we can challenge the assumptions when we're asked to do things which we feel are not supported by the evidence. But of course, it'd be nice to be backed up by schools and colleges. The government is now giving us far more freedom. We should use that freedom to start using evidence-based methods. We should make skills a priority. We could teach learning and thinking skills to our students, and we can implement staff training in evidence-based methods. So what action by government would be helpful? It would be really good if their policies contained only tested initiatives, if they set up a national evidence centre so that we could go somewhere for advice, if they started to treat teachers as though they were professionals, and perhaps if they set up an evidence-based qualification so that we could identify the experts. And finally, perhaps they would fund skills, our skills, rather than buildings or the ownership of property. We don't use medicines which haven't been tested. We should apply the same standards in teaching. Evidence-based teaching is the way ahead. If we follow the evidence, students' learning will improve.